Welcome to White People, Black Music, and Liberation. I'm Eric, and I'm here on the journey with you. This is a transmission at the intersection of race, music, and spirituality. It's about moving past the programming and into liberation.
It's February 2026, the Super Bowl. On one side, you've got the halftime show. Bad Bunny, who's a Puerto Rican artist singing mostly in Spanish, has put together a genuinely beautiful pan-Latino celebration. Artists representing countries from all over Latin America, signs affirming love over hate, people as far as the eye can see. It's festive, joyful, alive. And on the other side, you have a counter event, staged apparently because Bad Bunny singing in Spanish offends some Americans who wanted a show for the, quote, real Americans. And this event looks very different. Country singers lamenting about trans people ruining America, gas fires going off in the background, camera angles very carefully chosen to obscure the fact that there aren't that many people actually there. And headlining the whole thing is Kid Rock. And Kid Rock, if you look at him, he's a middle-aged white man dressed like a hip-hop star with like a dash of country thrown in. And he's performing one of his more popular songs that I actually remember from the 90s growing up, Ba With Da Ba, rap, rock / new metal track. And right there in that image is the thing that I want us to sit with today. Because the man chosen to represent the party of white America is a white man who built his entire career doing black music. This is a guy who came up in Detroit, mentored by black artists, rapping, DJing, steeped in black American culture. Welcome to America. In this episode, we're going to talk about Kid Rock, and in doing that, we're going to talk about something broader. White America's complicated relationship with black American music, and my own complicated relationship with it too, because I'm part of the story as well. Ready? Let's do it. To understand how we got here, we have to go back to the summer of 1987. A VFW hall in East Detroit. If you're not from the US, a VFW hall, well, it stands for Veterans of Foreign Wars Hall. It's basically a community gathering space. And in Detroit in the late 1980s, these halls were often like the heartbeat of community life, dances, parties, DJ nights. And a hip-hop collective called the Beast Crew is throwing a party. The Beast Crew is led by a man named James Harris, known around town as the Black Man. James Harris was Detroit's hip-hop godfather. He'd been on tour with Curtis Blow, LL Cool J, Roxanne Shanti. He formed the Beast Crew specifically to give kids in the neighborhood somewhere to be, something to do, a reason to stay off the streets. And it's a DJ contest night. And then somebody introduces the Beast Crew to this 16-year-old white kid from the suburbs who calls himself Kid Rock. His real name is Robert James Ritchie, or Bob Ritchie. And the kid asks, hey, can I get on the turntables? James Harris says, yeah, sure, let the white boy get on. And according to the people who were there, the whole party just kind of stopped, and he was actually doing really good. He was cutting and scratching records like crazy. People were looking at each other like, wow, Now think about the context a little bit. This is 1987, and Detroit at this particular moment is one of these really dramatic examples of what white flight does to a city. Back in 1940, Detroit was more than 90% white. And by the time Kid Rock is walking into that VFW hall, it's a majority black city. White families, white-owned businesses, they'd all fled to the suburbs in droves over the preceding decades, taking the tax base with them, really just hollowing out the city services and infrastructure and leaving behind a community that was pretty poor on paper, but very rich in culture. And Kid Rock's hometown of Romeo, Michigan is about 40 minutes north of downtown Detroit. And this is one of the suburbs that benefits from this exodus. His father owned a successful car dealership, and the family lives on a really nice 6-acre estate. And that context matters because the black community of Detroit that welcomed this kid had every reason not to, and they did it anyway. Wesley Gandy, who was a local rapper who met Ritchie when he was around 14, says, at that time, I never saw any white kids in my neighborhood. It was me that brought him into the city and introduced him to the Detroit culture. Bob is like a sponge. He absorbed a lot. And James Harris of the Beast Crew basically gave him what people in that world would call a hood pass. And Harris didn't just open the doors for him, he mentored him. In his own words, he says he raised them. He later helped him, together with D Nice, strategically move towards a deal with Jive Records in 1988. And Bay Area rap king Too Short actually produced tracks on that debut album. The cover art is really funny, and it's got like a cartoon Kid Rock with a high top fade. He's hanging out at his soul food joint with Harris like right next to him. He later went on tour with Too Short and Ice Cube. And so this is where Kid Rock started. Okay, so first of all, in my research for this piece, there was 2 particular articles that I wanted to name because they do a lot of heavy lifting here. The first is a 2024 Rolling Stone feature by David Peisner, and it's a really long sit down with Ritchie. Plus, he talked to a bunch of people from his circle too, and it's a really clear lens into his psyche if you're feeling brave. The second is from Anscape, which is ESPN's platform dedicated to black culture and identity, and their piece goes deep on Kid Rock's Detroit roots and the community he came up in. And I'm going to link to both of them in the show notes. They're very much worth your time. So back to the story. Kid Rock eventually gets dropped by Jive. And ironically, Vanilla Ice was to blame because labels were now suddenly really nervous about working with white rappers. But Ritchie kept working. And in 1998, he actually came out with an album, Devil Without a Cause, which ended up being really successful. It sold 14 million copies worldwide. And from there, he pivoted to more rap rock, then country, then southern rock, kind of continually moving from genre to genre, from audience to audience. And as the audiences shifted, so did he. So another one of the leaders of the Beast Crew was Brian Harmon, who's known as Champtown. And he remembers Ritchie being explicit about this pivot. At some point during the move away from hip-hop, Ritchie told him he needed to reconnect with his whiteness. And Wesley Gandy, another Detroit friend from that era, remembers the same thing. The Rolling Stone journalist actually asked Ritchie about this quote directly, and he didn't deny it. He said it sounded like something he would say. So Champtown's read on all of this is a bit more nuanced than you might expect. He doesn't call Kid Rock a thief. He calls their relationship an exchange. Kid Rock came to Detroit and he learned. And in return, he took Champtown to the suburbs, which opened up doors for him as a businessman. And those were doors that a lot of people from that neighborhood never got to go through. So there was relationship, there was reciprocity, at least for a while. And then something shifts. Champton says that when Ritchie got his Jive deal, the label had also been interested in signing him, but that Ritchie actively got in the way of it. And Ritchie disputes this, but the way Champton frames it, it's kind of hard to just throw that away. You know, he describes the ethic of the community that they came up in, and this is one of the worst zip codes in America. He says that you get a bag of chips, you share it. Kid Rock grew up with affluent parents, and this lesson may or may not have stuck with him. And Terrence Jones, also known as T-Bone, was there the night that Ritchie first got on the turntables at that VFW hall. And his take is pretty simple. He says Ritchie just turned his back on black folks. The reporting from Detroit kind of adds another layer here. The perception wasn't just that he left, it was that he took what those black mentors had helped him build and moved on without looking back. Now, I want to stop for a second because I can already hear some of you thinking, okay, but Kid Rock is kind of an extreme example. This isn't really about most white people who love black music. And that's exactly the point that I want to push on. Kid Rock is not exceptional. He's not even particularly rare. He just might be particularly visible. And this is a pattern that runs very, very deep in American and Western culture. Let's talk about Eric Clapton. So Eric Clapton is one of the most celebrated blues guitarists of the 20th century. He came to prominence in the UK in the 60s when Britain was just going crazy for Black American blues. And there was just like a handful of these white UK guitar players who became the go-to names for that sound, and Clapton was one of them. His entire career is built on the foundation of Black American music. And then Jimi Hendrix shows up in the UK. And, you know, Jimi Hendrix came up in what was known as the Chitlin circuit. And because the level of musicianship of these Black American musicians was so high, and the showmanship that went along with it, Hendrix could basically just outplay everyone. And by all accounts, it blew Clapton sideways. So Clapton actually tried to imitate him. He started perming his hair. He tried different approaches to just capture an ounce of what Jimmy was doing. There's this really fascinating 1968 Rolling Stone interview that's genuinely strange and layered. So on the surface of it, Clapton is actually praising Hendrix. He says Jimmy can sing well. He calls him one of the finest musicians on the Western scene. But then he says some things that are very layered. He basically argues that Jimmy's success in England is built on English people's fetishization of black men. He talks about the size of their phalluses, and then he accuses Hendrix of deliberately exploiting that fetishization, just being a showman. He uses a word that's, I'm just going to say it one time, but I won't repeat it, and that's the word spade. And this is a racial slur for black folks. And in the 60s in Britain, this was part of just kind of the everyday vocabulary of racism. And Clapton's use of it is revealing. It points to how casually dehumanizing the language of that era was among people who considered themselves fans or admirers of black artists. And what's really interesting here is what Clapton is revealing about himself. So this is an era where Clapton is God is being written on the walls in the streets of London. And then Jimi Hendrix shows up, and he's forged in this Black American musical tradition that Clapton had built his entire identity around. And Jimi Hendrix just operates on this completely higher plane. That had to land somewhere uncomfortable. And this detail about the perming makes it even weirder. So check this out. Clapton insists in the interview that he started perming his hair because of Bob Dylan, not Hendrix. That sounds to me a lot like a person who needs to establish that he got there first. And in fact, it seemed clear to everyone else what was going on. So that Rolling Stone interview, there was a cover photo of that. This is in 1968. And another writer describes that cover photo as Eric Clapton showing his, quote, 1967 Hendrix-inspired perm. Stranger than fiction, right? So I got to be honest, I can relate to the underlying feeling, the insecurity. I'm a light-skinned person who plays West African music. I know a thing or two about imposter syndrome. And that question is real and human, but there's a fork in the road. You can follow it inward, or you can deflect it outward onto the person who made you feel it. And Clapton goes the second way. And the result is this interview, a really fascinating, cringe-worthy documentation of a man who just can't really see himself. 8 years later, at a concert in Birmingham in August 1976, Clapton goes on stage. He makes public statements in support of a virulent anti-immigration politician. And this is a time when Caribbean folks were coming to the UK in significant numbers. Clapton gets on stage. He talks about how the country's being overtaken by black people and how Britain needs to be for white people. Eric Clapton, this is the man whose every dollar he made came from playing Black American blues music. So, yeah, a friend of mine puts this really well. We were talking about this the other day, and he was saying that racism is like a spell. It's a magical spell. It prevents us from seeing things that are right in front of us. I think that's exactly it. I mean, how else do you explain it? This music that's in your hands, it's in your body, it comes from black people, and somehow you still can't see those people as equal. I said you, I should have said we. You know, this music is in our hands, it's in our body, it comes from black people, and somehow we still can't see these people as equal. That's the spell in action. And I just want to be really clear. Kid Rock and Eric Clapton are not anomalies. The artists we celebrate for doing the right thing are the ones who get credited for the ones who do credit their black influences, who use their platforms to push for equality. We remember them precisely because they are exceptional, because they were rare. The praise itself is the tell. Okay, back to Kid Rock. So Terrence Jones, who we talked about before, T-Bone, the man who was there at that VFW hall in 1987, used to joke with him. He would tell him, oh, when you get older, you're going to be racist just like your daddy. And Kid Rock would deny it, and he'd deny it. Then Jones also told another story. So Jones lived in Arizona, and MLK isn't celebrated there, so they were trying to protest. They all had MLK shirts on, including Ritchie. And Jones asks a really good question. How do you go from wearing an MLK shirt to waving a Confederate flag? Because at some point in the early 2000s, Kid Rock starts performing with the Confederate flag as a stage backdrop. He claims it's a tribute to Leonard Skinner. So in 2011, the Detroit NAACP actually gave him an award, and he accepted it. And he stood on the stage and he told the crowd, I love America. I love Detroit and I love black people. I never flew that flag with any hate in my heart. And in another interview, he said, oh, it's just, it represents pride and Southern rock and roll music, and it just looks cool. Now, here's the thing. I don't think he's actually lying about his experience of it. I think he means every word of it. And that's exactly the issue. Because that flag, it doesn't just represent what he feels when he looks at it. It represents something very specific to the people who were oppressed by it. It's the flag of a cause that fought to preserve the institution of slavery. Now, this is an institution that's built on the exploitation and the brutalization of the very people who gave him everything he has musically. James Harris, the Beast Crew, Wesley Gandy, all the artists who mentored him, toured with him, opened doors for him, their ancestors, their community. And the flag just doesn't stop there. They didn't just fold that flag up and put it in a museum after the Civil War. During the civil rights movement, it got picked back up to send a very specific message to black folks who were demanding equality. And it's still being carried today by people who promote policies, ideas, and rhetoric that continues directly and indirectly to undermine the full equality of black Americans. And that entire story is lost on Kid Rock. He can only see his own relationship to the symbol, his own intent. And in that blindness, that total inability to ask how someone else might experience what he's doing, that's the spell that we're talking about. Then in 2019, things come to a head in Detroit. So Kid Rock had this restaurant inside Little Caesars Arena, right in the heart of the city. Kid Rock's Made in Detroit. And that November, he got drunk on stage and he went on a profanity-laced rant against Oprah Winfrey, like some pretty disgusting stuff. And that video went viral. And people started protesting outside the restaurant. And the NAACP, that same organization that had given him that award 8 years earlier, now their own political directors calling him the tip of an ugly iceberg of hate and demanding that the award be rescinded. And I think Kid Rock's response to all this was really telling. He made a post on Facebook. He said, "I still have much love for the city of Detroit and the people and the organizations that I've helped there for years, black, white, whatever. But I learned long ago, go where you're celebrated, not tolerated." So this is the city that made him. This is the community that handed him everything he needed to build a very successful career. In that Rolling Stone article that I was talking about earlier, he actually brags about how he has over $300 million in the bank. And you think about the black mentors who said, yeah, let the white boy get on. And when they finally come out and say, no, you're out of line, his response is, you're not celebrating me enough. There's another detail inside the Rolling Stone interview that I think is an interesting lens into his psyche. When he was being pressed on how divisive he is, he says, oh, I'm just one of those polarizing people, no question. And there's this vibe of like, oh, I'm comfortable with that. Maybe I'm even proud of it. There's a difference, though, between being polarizing and perpetuating harm. You know, polarizing is a word that makes it about personality, about being edgy, seeing oneself as provocative, too real for polite company. It's like somehow very egoic language, and it kind of lets you off the hook. It doesn't really ask, who's getting hurt by what I'm doing? Who am I accountable to? There's another interesting layer to all of this, which is American capitalism. So if you look at Kid Rock's career as a whole, there's kind of a pattern. Hip hop in the late 80s, rap rock in the 90s, country in the 2000s, southern rock, and now MAGA America's official celebrity. And every move seems to be kind of chasing something. And to be honest, the people around him have said as much. His former lawyer described him as someone who has always had his pulse on who his audience is. I don't think that's an insult. That's just an accurate description of how he's operated his entire career. Is Kid Rock a true believer in the MAGA cause? To be honest, I think the more interesting and probably more useful for us direction to take this is to look at the structure underneath it. The system that actually made his path the profitable one. So compare him to Eminem. Same city, same debt to Black Detroit. And when the political moment came, Eminem drew a line. He told his own fans publicly that if they supported Trump, they weren't welcome in his world anymore. And he took that risk because a huge chunk of his fan base lives in red states, places where, you know, a lot of listeners are also Trump supporters. And that cost was real. He later wrote rhymes reflecting publicly on watching his fan base shrink so much. And he's gone back and forth on whether he did it in the most skillful way possible, but he's always maintained that the stand he took was the right one. And Kid Rock kind of looked at that same fork in the road and just went the other direction. And here's what that looks like. Because suddenly, for every longtime fan that walked away from him from the politics, new people showed up. And these new people have never even heard of Kid Rock before. People who didn't care about his music. So in that Rolling Stone article, they read some of the comments on his videos and they say things like, "Oh, I didn't even like Kid Rock. I didn't even like his music. But damn if I'm not going to go to the shows and support this guy." So he didn't really just like retain an audience. He swapped one out for a bigger, angrier one. And just to give you an idea of what that looks like in person, at a 2024 festival in Louisiana, Kid Rock performs for more than 25,000 fans, totally surrounded by American flags and Trump merchandise. He's being introduced by Tucker Carlson. Trump appears on the giant screen behind him, and Kid Rock declares from the stage that Joe Biden could kiss his Anglo-Saxon ass. Pretty funny, I gotta hand it to him. So the spell isn't just cultural, it's economic. The system is designed, whether anyone intended it to or not, to reward extraction from black culture and to penalize solidarity. Eminem chose the solidarity. He paid the price for it. Kid Rock chose the other direction. And the crowds just keep getting bigger for him. And I think it's interesting to ask a question, is it really even about politics for him? You know, people close to him suggest that this right-wing awakening could be as much about managing the emotional fallout of a career that's been waning as it is about any deep-seated beliefs. He's a performer. He wants to be in the spotlight. And, you know, he's more than a decade removed from any sort of big hit. The MAGA crowd kind of gives him something back, something that a casino gig in Morongo Valley couldn't, you know, the feeling of being at the center of something, the dopamine of relevance. And that might actually explain some of the story too. And, you know, our reach as a band, Orchestra Gold, it's nowhere near any of this. It's on a completely different scale. But I have experienced this dynamic. I've noticed the desire in myself to curb my own impulses to talk about justice in the context of Orchestra Gold. You know, the emails that people unsubscribe from the most are the ones where I talk about justice. But here's another interesting, uncomfortable piece of this. Most of us never really have to make a decision that's that dramatic. We never have to really publicly choose a side. We can just keep loving the music, keep benefiting from it, and never quite get around to asking what we owe in return. And that's the more common version of the story, and that's my version of the story that I was in for a really long time. So I want to name something here before I go further. As much fun as it can be to name the problem, Kid Rock, Eric Clapton, the history, you know, the pattern is actually the easy part. And it's also where most of the anti-racism stops. We name the problem, we point our fingers, we go home feeling a little bit better about ourselves. I feel better about myself already. But that's not what this episode is about. Because the point of this discussion, at least for me, isn't to jump on a bandwagon and criticize Kid Rock. Okay, maybe a little bit. But the real point is that it's an invitation for each of us to look inside and find out where that shadow may still be alive. And I can tell you where mine lived. I've talked about this before, but it's still relevant here. Years ago, I was in a relationship with the woman that I met through our drum and dance community. And, you know, she was black. I'm a light-skinned, white assumed person of Arab and American ancestry. And I've always benefited, I should say, from white assumed privilege in this society, whether I wanted to acknowledge it or not. And she would continually come back to a question for me: how are you giving back? As a light-skinned person who loves Black music, what are you doing? And I didn't have the awareness at that stage to really understand what she was talking about. I didn't have the framework yet to see that I had a responsibility as a person of privilege who had taken and taken and taken and taken from Black culture without even thinking to ask myself that question. It got into a point where I'd been studying and playing music for a long time. And in all that time, I'd never really paused to ask, what do I owe here? What does reciprocity look like? Why was that so easy for me? And it's because that's the setup. This is the playing field. We live in a society where it's considered completely normal, completely acceptable for a person like me to take and never give. And I was just living in that. Had it not been for her voice, I really don't know how long it would have taken me to see it. And when I look at where that sense of entitlement was rooted, I can see it pretty clearly now. I believed at some level that I was entitled to just take, and I expected people to give freely. And of course, this was all invisible to me at the time, and that's the shadow. That's the version of the spell that lived in me. It wasn't a Confederate flag. It was just kind of a quiet, invisible assumption that the world, and specifically the gifts of Black American music, were mine to enjoy without any obligation. And I think that quiet, invisible version is actually more common than Kid Rock. So where does all of this go? I don't think the answer is guilt. Guilt that doesn't lead anywhere is just self-indulgence. But I do think the answer starts with the same question she kept asking me: how am I giving back? And it doesn't have to be a grand gesture or a political statement. It doesn't have to be $50,000. It can be relational. It can be in community. It can be in small daily choices about whose art I support, whose voices I amplify, whose liberation I actually show up for. What if the solutions to all this were actually very small? What if they were found in community? And what if we started being honest about the spell that we've been living under? Especially those of us who deeply love Black American music. Okay, be seeing you.
I'm Eric, and this has been White People, Black Music, and Liberation. If this message speaks to you and you want to be part of the journey, head to whitepeopleblackmusic.com and let's build a world where liberation is for everyone.